Back. It's another episode of the Nick Dagan Best Rambles Alone live stream. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me, all of you who have not yet entered the room. All right. Yeah, there's a lot going on out there. One thing I was thinking about talking about today is France and what's going on there. Um, it's revolution time again, it seems. Pluto's back in Aquarius. Of course, Pluto was in Aquarius when the French Revolution began in 1789. Mind you, by the time the French Revolution began, Pluto had been in Aquarius for 21 years at that point. So we're not anywhere near, the Pluto return of the French Revolution. That's still a little ways away. Shy Maid is first. All right. I'm glad that's a badge of honor. Let's see how many more of you join me. Okay. I should have put out the announcement a little sooner than I did. It's a holiday Monday here, and it's easy. Oh, look at you guys for a second. All right. Let's admit you might be the only two people I'm talking to today. It might be the Shy Maid, Joshua, Nick. Yeah. The third person's joined. Shy Maid, Joshua, and a third person, and me in a little circle. We can. All right, good. More and more people are joining. That's fantastic. Adam, I'm not sure that you're third. I think you're actually fourth. Paradigm shift. All right. Cool. People are joining. Oh, now I really do have people in the room. Ben Commons is here. Oh, wow. Now that's a privilege. You folks don't know Ben Commons is the best kept secret in astrology. He's shy and unlike most of the great astrologers in the world, Ben is sort of hides from the spotlight. You know, most of us are attention junkies, not the great Ben Commons. Yeah, it's a real privilege and pleasure to have him join the live stream as well. So, but welcome. It's a pleasure and privilege, of course, to have you all join me. So welcome. Actually, Ben's a good one to have in the room today because, yeah, I was thinking about talking about France and what the hell's going on in France. France has exploded in revolts all over the country due to the police shooting of a teenage, I believe he's an Arab African boy. This exacerbates long-standing racial tensions in France. And France has this very peculiar relationship to race. They're the classic, like, we don't see race folks. You know, they invented that, which is, you know, ideologically admirable in the abstract, but not really workable in a sort of, you know, in a society that has a pretty broad class division between whites and non-whites. That's right. The French have never recorded ethnicity in their citizens, so they don't even. Yeah, it's not remarked upon at all. Which, as it turns out, is no less helpful than, you know, say what we have in South Africa, where even to this day, you know, on census forms and what have you, there's all these different categories. Or Brazil is even, I think, crazier in that way. I forget how Brazil's got like dozens of racial classifications. So it's, you know, different countries find different ways to screw this up. I think is the you know, the long and short of it. And there goes Ben. So Ben Commons has lived in France, and sometimes he and I have little chats in French. But the problem is I speak French with a Quebec accent, and anyone who's lived in Europe thinks my French accent sounds a little crude and hard to penetrate. So I've met some playful derision on that front. So yeah, there you go. It's actually a pretty common thing. The best way to describe it is my French accent you might liken to like a a thick Southern drawl or a Brooklyn, accent or something really hard North American sounding. Whereas Ben speaks in that sort of prissy little European accent that sounds funny to us in Quebec. So it's just yeah, Ben's accent sounds like a posh British accent, and I sound like I'm from like rural Texas. That would be the way to sort of explain the difference between our French accents to non-French speaking peoples. Anyway, we're okay. Now he's saying it's fabulous. Yes, yes, it is. All right. So France. Yeah, S.J. Anderson made a good point that you know he talked about on Twitter how Saturn's in Pisces right now, and France is exploding. And okay. Shy made your French would be worse. Your accent would be worse than mine. Oh, my accent's great. My accent is not bad. It's just Ben's appraisal of my accent is bad. Let's be clear. There's a lot of things wrong with Quebec, but the way they speak French is not one of them. I love my French accent, and I sort of play it up to tease those Europeans. Anyway, S.J. Anderson was mentioning that Saturn's in Pisces now, as it was in 1789 when the French Revolution exploded, and you got the three estates and the storming of the Bastille. One thing that the French Revolution gave us that we still really have central in virtually all societies in the world today is the concept of left wing and right wing. That came right out of the early days of the French Revolution with the founding of the National Assembly, which is like a French parliament, and the sort of rival factions of that parliament, the more sort of aggressive and progressive faction sat on the left side of the National Assembly, and the more sort of conservative faction was on the right. And so this is a terminology that we still use today that emerged from that phenomenon. But as it happens, the French Revolution is not the only instance. It's not like France has just been this peaceful, complex, like they had the French Revolution, then everything was cool for 250 years, and then, suddenly out of nowhere, they're in trouble again. France's history since the Revolution has had a series of sort of popular uprisings and protests, and heck, regime changes. I mean, since the French Revolution, after the old regime, the Ancien Regime, as they call it, France has had 2 empires and 5 republics. I mean, that's insane. And yeah, on the one hand, excuse me. On the one hand, SJ and other astrologers online, they're looking at the birth chart for the 5th Republic to examine these riots, which in some sense is correct, because it is specifically the regime of the 5th Republic. Macron's government is the current sort of incarnation of the 5th Republic. So that is what the people are rebelling against. But I mean, France is also a great example of why national charts are also limited, because here we are. I mean, this is the chart for the French Constitution being. Oh wait, I got to share my screen. I'm going to do that whole thing again, where I talk about charts I'm looking at and forget to share my screen. So here we are. This is my France chart file. You can see it has 1,255 charts in it. It's events and nativities. So, various, like, it can be a film director, a judo champion, the first husband of a prime minister's wife, and then, but a lot of politicians. Here, there's another actor, Jean Reno. But I have a lot of French politicians, a fair number of them anyway. Oh no, I'm sorry. Claude Chirac was there was a suicide, I think. Claude Chirac was the daughter of Jacques Chirac, and I think her husband committed suicide. That there was some kind of scandal like that in the 90s. I don't want to screw that up. I was just looking randomly through this file I have on France. This chart file I have on France. Arthur Rimbaud dying, and Alfred Nobel after he's invented dynamite. Eric Satie composing music. Rimbaud publishing poetry. All kinds of different stuff. Berlin Conference in West Africa, that's obviously really, really important. Impressionist exhibitions, Victor Hugo's 79th birthday celebration, which is 79 is a solar return where you get simultaneous Mercury and Mars returns. So we know Victor Hugo must have had very interesting Mercury and Mars in his charts. We're not going to explore that today. I'm just sort of taking you through the kind of things that I have in this file. So as I was saying, while I think, SJ is doing sound astrology when he's looking at this chart, this Constitution, the publication of the Constitution. I think he was looking for a time, I'm not sure. The Constitution went into effect at midnight, so that's the time I use. And this is the chart here. And then just a couple of months later, the architect of this Constitution, Charles de Gaulle, was proclaimed president of France, a position he would hold for the next 10 years. This was coming out of the whole civil war in Algeria, which started in 1954. Just after France was defeated at Dien Bien Phu by the Vietnamese, they suddenly had a new colony to fight a big, costly war with. During the Venus retrograde in Scorpio of 1954, the Red 2 of 1954. And yeah, the Algerian Civil War was sort of one of the initial cases of former African colonies claiming their independence. Algeria for France, and then Ghana for Britain in 1957. And then as the late 50s turned into the 60s, you had a whole series of African countries declaring independence. Thanks partly because Britain and France saw fit to change that arrangement. France has a very different approach to decolonization than England, and still has a fair amount of financial control over their former colonies in Africa. And that all, again, sort of comes out of this creation of the Fifth Republic. And that sort of determined a new relationship between France and its former colonies, and sort of redefined France as a country, redefined it politically. All right. Well, what I wanted to do here is just to take you through a sort of series, since I have, all these charts on French history that go back. The oldest one here is for King Philip II of Flanders, and his birth chart in 1165. So there's, and then the first event I have here is the Knights Templar being arrested, in the time of the Crusades and all that stuff. And here's a pogrom that happened in Strasbourg in 1349. And then, eventually it gets more serious. Of course, being from Montreal, I have to look at Jacques Cartier, coming to the New World and planting a cross on Mount Royal in Montreal, and then later it's Champlain, Samuel de Champlain, arriving in Quebec and establishing a colony. So yeah, obviously being from Montreal, that's going to be my interest in French history, my strongest interest. But here, what I'm going to do is looking at this file. I want to look at Saturn in Pisces, but also Saturn in Aries, because really, when you look at the historical arc of uprisings in France, you see that it's actually like Saturn in Pisces is where things can really start getting crazy, but it tends to continue, and if anything, intensify when Saturn goes into Aries after the fact. So I already think that what's happening now it has a longer shelf life than a mere sort of social uprising that sort of explodes and burns itself out. That this has more consequence than we could imagine. All right, so first I'm just going to look at Saturn in Pisces, and then I'll look at Saturn in Aries in French history, and we'll get a sense of what we're going through here. Okay, now mostly I'm there is some really interesting stuff in early Montreal history. Montreal is a very Piscean city. It's in many ways. Here's the chart for Montreal has Saturn in Pisces. This is the chart for the founding of Montreal with Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in Pisces. And this is a city with a giant lit up cross at the top of the mountain that overlooks everything. And even this Neptune at 28 Scorpio, two returns later, there would be a huge political crisis when Neptune returned to that degree in 1970. So yeah, it's a sun opposite Neptune. It's a city, the first thing that was built was a hospital. It was generally populated by a lot of nuns and priests. So yeah, you get a lot of that sort of Pisces vibe there. But then, of course, there's the other side of Montreal, which is sort of like the Tijuana of the north, the city of well, at least when I was growing up, the city of strip bars, and it's a port city. So think of like Hamburg or Rotterdam or any of these places where sailors, get off a ship after a long time at sea and go look for, the kind of things that sailors enjoy for a good time. And that was a big part of what Montreal provided for years and years. All right, but back to France. So I'll go right to the French Revolution. Let's stay modern here. The French Estates General, like France was in sort of economic trouble, and for the first time in 200 years, no, 100 and something years, nearly 200 years. I forget the exact number. The French Estates General was convened, and these were the sort of the French nobles and the French clergy would convene to sort of the king would call them together to sort of discuss crises exploding in France. But this is when you got a popular uprising. The French National Assembly was created out of what they called the Third Estate, which was just the people in general. Now how we have the phrases the first world and the third world. This is another sort of source of that terminology. The first estate were the nobles, the second estate were the clergy, and then the third estate, the people, the masses. And obviously the third estate was much bigger than the other two, which were elite groups. And this is part of what the French Revolution entails, is a sort of rising of the third estate, of the people, against the other two estates. So you can see Saturn's in Pisces here. In 1789. When the king tries to lock the third estate out of the talks because they're agitating for too much power. And so they go to this nearby tennis court that's close to Versailles, and they swear what's called the tennis court oath, that they swear to not leave until their voices are heard in the National Assembly. And so, that's an early victory that the people can claim. Shortly afterwards, there's the famous storming of the Bastille prison, because the citizens are concerned that the king is going to use weapons to quash the Third Estate. And the Bastille is a prison. There aren't very many inmates in there, but there's an armory in there, and so the people want to seize the weapons that are in there. But it gets a little bloody, and they wind up decapitating the sort of what's the word of the superintendent or whatever he's called, the head of the prison. They chop his head off and parade it around in a pike. And spoiler alert, that's gonna that's gonna become a thing. Another interesting facet of the storming of the Bastille, and the French Revolution, generally speaking. So you can see Pluto down here in Aquarius, and like I said, we're already 21 years into Pluto being in Aquarius at this point. Pluto will go into Pisces towards the end of the decade, just before, spoiler alert, Napoleon comes along and well, he either brings the revolution to a conclusion or he takes it to another place, depending on how you want to look at it. But what's interesting here also, Uranus in Leo coming into opposition with the Pluto in Aquarius. And you see it here with Venus and Jupiter. So you've got this trio. This is, again, a popular uprising. Uranus, of course, has only been discovered 8 years earlier. Uranus was discovered when it was in Gemini in 1781. And in that time, it's only moved over to Leo. So we have this new planet of revolution tied in with the two benefics at the top of the chart when the Bastille is stormed. In particular, this conjunction of Venus and Uranus and Leo just pops up over and over and over the course of the French Revolution. I think. Well, I'll have to come back to that. We're still looking at Saturn in Pisces here, but I want to let's put a bookmark on that, and I'll come back to it. So following this, there's the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens is adopted. You've all heard the phrase liberté, égalité, fraternité, and that's that comes out of this period in 1789. Finally, towards the end of the year, with Saturn still in Pisces, the women revolutionaries of Paris march to Versailles. That's a good, I think it's 10, 12 kilometers, something like that. It's a better part of the day. Like if you leave in the morning, you'll get there in the afternoon, that kind of thing. But they march to Versailles and they bring the king and queen back to Paris because they don't want them sort of isolated out in Versailles. With this new revolution, they're not yet anti-monarchists. That'll come later, but they want the king and queen to sort of be with the people, as opposed to safely tucked away at Versailles, which is, like I said, sort of out of far away enough from Paris that the people don't really have access to them. And that's there's a few other things. I guess the main thing is that a guy named Joseph Guillotine proposes this new high-tech execution machine. Remember, this is the Industrial Revolution. This is the age of Uranus. New technology is being derived. Of course, Mr. Guillotine's execution machine winds up becoming known as the guillotine, something that his descendants are not terribly proud of. It turns out. So yeah, that's now. I'll come back to the French Revolution when I look at Saturn and Aries, and I'll explain some of that Venus, Uranus, and Leo stuff that I was talking about earlier. But just sticking with this thread involving Saturn in Pisces. After Saturn leaves Pisces during these early days of the French Revolution, it doesn't come back until, of course, 29-ish years later, by which point Napoleon has been defeated and he's tucked safely away in St. Helena. This is a Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle. This is part of the Concert of Europe, the other parties that defeated Napoleon coming together this is a sort of precursor of the EU in a way. This is Austria, Russia, Britain, and not Germany. Germany doesn't exist, but Prussia. coming together and discussing the fate of Europe. And yeah, that's that. Everything's sort of, Europe's kind of starting to explode in revolution. That Greece is going to rise up against the Ottoman Empire, and that could have been a big sort of popular thing. Britain eventually does come in on the side of Greece, but Greece was hoping for Russian support at this point, and Russia's quite had enough of revolution. Anyway, moving on to the next Saturn return, we get to 1848. This is the beginning of the February Revolt of 1848. This is also, sort of the mass uprising in France. You see, Neptune has just gone into Pisces. Neptune's just been discovered. So the French Revolution of 1789, erupted not long after Uranus was discovered, in 8 years. And then the 1848 revolts, which really happened all over Europe, although the ones in Paris were really, really significant. The June days of Paris, the insurrection begins here with, you can see Saturn on the south node. So yeah, these are sort of, the Neptunian revolutions of 1848. The consequence of this for the United States of America is a lot of the sort of the would-be revolutionaries of 1848, be they Polish, Hungarian, Swedish, French, what have you, they start moving to the United States because they've just lost a revolution and they fear persecution, or things are just too messed up. And this is when, the U.S. really starts to become a melting pot in the way we think of it. Up until this point, the United States, you really just have like these former British colonists and their African slaves, and that's about it, But now you're really getting Europeans from all over in large numbers coming and colonizing the U.S. And of course, it's also right at this point in 1848 that the U.S. has just won its war with Mexico, has just acquired a bunch of territory, including California, where gold will be discovered. I could come back to that later if need be. Anyway. Yeah, these are again really sort of bloody revolts. They're not terribly successful, and they end that year with Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon, being elected the first French president. Saturn's still in Pisces here, but spoiler alert: when it goes into Aries, he's going to seize power in a coup and name himself emperor, and he's going to be the emperor of the Second French Empire. So we're going from the Second French Republic to the Second French Empire shortly. All right, jumping ahead another Saturn cycle. And we get to 1877, and this is a big crisis. Saturn's back in Pisces, you see, back around 18 degrees, where it tends to be when these things happen, sort of second, third decan of Saturn in Pisces. And it's 1877. Now, France had lost the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71, and so Napoleon III, who, as I mentioned, seized power in a coup when Saturn was in Aries 30 years earlier, or 20-something years earlier. He's been deposed, and the French Third Republic is created, and this will be a really long-standing government that lasts from the 1870s until the Nazi invasion of 1940. And then even after the Second World War, you'll have the Fourth French Republic up until de Gaulle changes the constitution, creates the fifth one in 1958. And the Fourth French Republic is, I think, identical to the third one. It's just it was broken up by the Vichy regime of the Second World War. Anyway, with this event, you had there was this struggle that the Third French Republic was trying to define itself between sort of a more left-wing progressive Republican faction and then sort of more conservative monarchist faction. And with this crisis, when the monarchist president fired the Republican prime minister, there was a big uprising, and the the people sort of took power, and this was when it had been dicey over the course of the 1870s whether France would return to being a monarchy or whether it would go on being a republic, and this was sort of the definitive event that sealed the fate of France and ensured that it would be a republic from here on. Um, yeah, no, later on, the next Saturn return, the president of France survives a bomb attack, and there's this is in the midst of the whole Dreyfus scandal and everything going on there. Um, but I want to jump ahead here to the 1930s. Okay, I don't have the charts here that I would be looking for. Okay, well, I'm just going to move on to the 60s. Sorry about that. In the 60s, de Gaulle is now reelected president of France, but he keeps sort of every election he has is a sort of a new referendum on him, changing the constitution, giving himself more and more power. And he's also sort of falling out with Lyndon Johnson over NATO, and signing a cooperation agreement with the Soviet Union, and criticizing the Vietnamese War. And yeah, things get really sort of hot between France and de Gaulle and the people. And when Saturn goes into Aries in 1968, there's going to be another sort of huge uprising. And finally, the last time Saturn was Aries, not quite the same sort of fights and what have you. Mitterrand died, Chirac took over as president. The Channel was opened, I guess, is one thing we can look at. But that's the Saturn in Pisces story, and I'm going to take you through the Saturn in Aries one in a moment. But I'm just going to check chat while I set this up and see if I've gotten any questions. Yeah, not just France, all over Europe, Vienna, exactly. Let's see. I'm not being hard on myself. I'm good at French. I'm reasonably good. I'd be better if I stayed in Montreal. But actually, even in South Africa, I wound up speaking French too. Yeah, I meet people from Congo and Mali and places like that, because Cape Town's a real cosmopolitan place. So I meet French Africans. We have a lot of French Africans in Quebec as well, in Montreal. But yeah, in South Africa, I meet them. Chelsea's asking, have I ever looked at the Venus retrograde cycle with the Middle East? Saw today that Israel attacked the West Bank today with the largest assault in 20 years. I did see that in the news, Chelsea. I study the Middle East to some degree, but it gets really hard because like they're always like, this might be the biggest attack in 20 years, but it's kind of a quagmire. There's just always so much trouble in the Middle East. Excuse me. That I find it kind of overwhelming to study. It's not a place where, like even France has these sort of, ups and downs. And so you have something that you can trace astrologically. Whereas, the Middle East, frankly, it's like, the amplifier's cranked up to 11 the whole time. There's no sort of soft, hard dynamic. It's just hard all the way, which I find just is harder to track astrologically. But I am, working on it. I'm doing a lot of reading. I read a book about Hezbollah not long ago. I've read a few books about the founding of Israel. I'm trying to be. It's part of my just broader project is to really have a handle on geopolitics, in every corner of the globe and understand it astrologically. And I'm on my way there, but it's by no means perfect. And I would certainly say the Middle East is one of my weaker areas of knowledge for the time being. Let's see. Oh yeah. Okay. Maria Dange has an interesting observation. So she says, Charles de Gaulle wanting to stop U.S. dollar and create money backed by gold, but had to deal with central banks and financing rioters. Sound familiar? Macron is wanting to tilt towards BRICS. Really? You think Macron wants to tilt towards BRICS? Look, I know that the EU, I could see France bolting from the EU, but I just don't see how BRICS can possibly work because none of those countries have a navy that can sustain global trade. Um, Look, when it comes to the S in BRICS stands for South Africa, and I've been living in South Africa for 7 years, and I see their navy. I can look out our balcony and see their navy in Cape Town, and they have one or two submarines, and not that much else. Um, I don't know how Brazil would ever manage to ship something to China or Russia without encountering brigadiership, piracy, like, national piracy, uh, Indonesia, Japan, Philippines, India, Sri Lanka, any of these countries would, if they saw something heading to China that they also wanted for themselves, they could easily seize that ship. And really, the only reason we've had global trade all these years is because of the American Navy policing the waters and making it possible. I just don't see how BRICS is supposed to work as a trade arrangement, without the U.S. Navy or anything to replace it. The globalist order is over for the time being, and I don't see that working. But it's true that the EU, and particularly France's relationship with it could easily fall to the wayside. So, do I think the birth of the État should go back to the first overthrow of Le Roi? Elsa, that's sort of that's oversimplifying. My point is that um, it's fine to use the chart for the Fifth Republic, but you don't just want to use the chart for the Fifth Republic. And I think in some ways using any France is a great example of how using any natal chart has limitations, because even if you're looking at the chart for the uh, um, for the overthrow of the king and the first French Republic in the 1790s that ensued from the storming of the Bastille and all that, you're still cutting off, like, a century plus of not a century, a millennia plus of really important formative French history. Um, in some ways, it makes sense to start with Charlemagne, when looking at all of Europe. But then I think really my position is that you just want to be aware of as much of the sort of the astrological history of a region as you can, and view the latest establishment of a state, of a nation state, being sort of a step along the way. And you can use that chart as a reference point for events that follow. But you don't want to have this, the chart for the Fifth French Republic, it describes the regime, but surely you can't say it describes France, as a region. A chart cast in 1958 just omits so much history, and I think it suits the astrologer more to yeah, to have a sense of as much of the timeline as you can. So yeah, it's not so much that I'm trying to sort of do away with national charts. I think they should be understood in their context and discussed in their context. Nia's saying here, Nick, I was re-listening to my contribution in the VR with Chris and Patrick, and I pointed out the peace treaty. Okay, I'm not sure what you mean by that, or just that peace treaties, generally speaking, are signed during Venus retrogrades. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Okay. All right. Jonna seems to be trying to get me to not talk about France right now, so I'm going to stay on France. I'm not going to be talking about. I might come to these correlations later. Let's see what. Okay. Girl from yonder wants to know what brought me to South Africa. Well, I went to an astrology conference in Cape Town. I was invited to speak there in 2015, and I wound up falling in love with the woman who organized the conference, and moved there to be with her and got married, and I really love it there. I mean, um, I had suffered in Montreal. I had this health condition that uh, it kept me largely bedridden for a good 7 years, and the healthcare system in Montreal is just it's abysmal. Um, Hospitals are at like 200% capacity, and there's just not enough family doctors. And I can't put my life in their hands, and if I can't live in Montreal, I had done this before where I really need to find a place in the world where I can be, and Cape Town is very comfortable for me. It's the best, brings out the best version of my chart. And a lot of people in Cape Town are like me. I meet people from, well, my wife was a refugee from Mozambique, and you meet people from all over the world who go to Cape Town because they just can't live in their home cities or their home countries. I'm close to a lot of Zimbabweans in Cape Town, and we're all in that same sort of situation where we come from these sort of broken, corrupt places, and we're just looking for a spot on planet Earth where we can actually exist. So, I mean, that's really what brought me there. Ironically, now I'm in Vancouver because my stepkids are going to university here, and we want to be together as a family. But yeah, my heart's in Cape Town for sure. Oh, and Chris is saying here, it seems the event that set off the recent riots coincided with the Mars-Uranus square. Are there any other notable hard aspects between Mars and Uranus in French history? That's a great question. Okay, so I will get to the Saturn and Uranus in a moment. Saturn and Aries in a moment, but let's go with Chris's question here and explore. I don't know the answer to this, but in this file on France, we're going to have Mars square Uranus. And I'm going to use a 5-degree orb just for now. I can make it bigger or smaller as I see fit. And what do we have here? Oh yeah, well, this is a big one. Okay. When Algeria got its independence, actually, ironically, 61 years ago today. This is after this really long, bloody civil war. Algeria got its independence. This was, de Gaulle's doing. He saw that holding on to the colony was just, too much trouble for everyone. And so, and he was actually, look, he was elected during a Mars-Uranus square, and then proclaimed president of France during a Mars-Uranus square, because Mars had been retrograde in late 58. So it was a lingering Mars-Uranus square. You can see this is December of 58. Mars at 16, Taurus square Uranus at 15. And even here, like 2 weeks later, because Mars had just been retrograde, it's barely moved 2 weeks later. So it's this long, long square. Actually, that's an interesting point, contradicting what I was just saying about national charts and their limitations. You can see that France, this Fifth Republic of France, was founded during a sort of an extra long Mars-Uranus square due to the fact that Mars had been retrograde. And it went from Gemini to Taurus over the course of 58. And so here it is during this, as the after the Constitution has been approved or proclaimed in October of 58, de Gaulle's elected president, and he's proclaimed president during this elongated square. And then the Algerian independence, 3.5 years later, happens with a Mars-Uranus square here. And then the following day, there's this, what they call the Oran massacre, a town called Oran. Basically, it was the great fear of the French colonists, who they called the Pieds Noirs, the Blackfeet. These were obviously European French who were living in Algeria, and That was what they called themselves, and they were basically they were set upon by the you know the Algerians that you know the Algerians who are African. And yeah, it was this big sort of massacre in the French military because the French military no longer had jurisdiction there. They didn't do anything to stop it, and it became this sort of long, bitter, subject for France. But it is interesting that De Gaulle came to power under that Mars Uranus square, very much to deal with the Algerian crisis, and then this is the culmination of the Algerian crisis after Algeria achieves independence, and this is sort of revenge for the bloody civil war. Besides that, well, there's sort of here we have the proclamation of the First Republic was also Mars Uranus. Wow, they really like their Uranus and Leo too. That's a whole other subject for France. They've got a real sort of tendency to go with that. But as you can see, I mean, I have a fair number of charts for public uprisings in France and also battles that the French military fought, and not a lot of them wind up in the Mars Uranus square thing. But let's go back to looking at Saturn and Aries, just to touch on what we were talking about earlier with regard to SJ's pointing out the Saturn in Pisces as a sort of recurring place in French uprisings. So this is these are all the Saturn in Aries events in French history that I have here. And you can see, like, when we get to the French Revolution, remember I started it with Saturn in Pisces and the storming of the Bastille, the tennis court oath, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the October Women's March. So here we have the civil constitution of the clergy being passed. One of the first sort of really bloody, the indication that at this point the French Revolution isn't that bloody, besides the storming of the Bastille and what happened there. But this is an army mutiny that gets really bloody in the summer of 1790. And more violence. The Day of Daggers. Of course, some very important works of literature are published, but that's besides the point. And then we get to the French National Guard, the Champ de Mars massacre, where you had the army opening fire on some innocent citizens. Sound familiar? That's not a Mars Uranus square, but it is a Mars Jupiter square. But there's Saturn in Aries, once again with the South Node, which seems to be common when these things come up. The Haitian slave rebellion. This is a huge deal. This leads to Haiti becoming, independent. The only place where a slave rebellion resulted in the creation of a new state. And things just get, as Saturn in Aries progresses, it just gets more and more bloody until just before it leaves Aries, when it's at 25 Aries. Louis XVI is executed. And that's, the revolution really becomes something else at that point. From here, you get into the Terror, and then the Great Terror, and then the response to the Great Terror, so on and so forth. But this is really with Saturn in Aries, it shows you how it just sort of escalated. What started, the king hadn't been in this kind of trouble when Saturn was in Pisces, but he tried to escape with his family back here when Saturn was in Aries, 2 years or a year and a half earlier. He tried to escape with his family, and they were caught. And from then on, they were seen with suspicion and thought to be traitors. And that's what really led to the royal family's downfall. All right. Now, going to the next, to the 1840s. Remember, I talked about the 1848 revolutions that were happening all over Europe. And Louis Napoleon, at the end of 1848, was elected president of the Second French Republic, but then he goes and leads a coup. He's the president already, but he wants to be like his uncle and be emperor. So he leads this coup d'état and seizes absolute power and becomes the emperor of the Second French Republic, which will last for 20 years until he's defeated in the Franco-Prussian War. Right. From there, the 1780s and 90s, this is, not necessarily a sort of a bloody time at all. There is the Treaty of Berlin on the Balkans being signed, but that doesn't really have anything. France is a participant, but doesn't really have an interest as such, or not as much as say Russia does. But then we get to the late 1930s, and leading up to the period when France will be invaded, and finally the student riots in Paris, which is where I wanted to go when Saturn was in Aries. These were in the spring of 1968. There was a big student uprising in France that led to riots all over. And it created a whole new sort of culture of political radicalism amongst the young baby boomers, who would hereforth refer to themselves as the 68, the 68ers. And of course, I was born in 68, so I think of myself as a sort of honorary 68er. And yeah, finally, it resulted in the resignation of Charles de Gaulle during a red 1 Venus retrograde. Charles de Gaulle has just Venus retrograde all over. He was born during a Venus retrograde. He was born during a red 2. He would die during a red 2, and there's a lot of Venus retrograde in his life, but that's a subject for another talk. Anyway, let's see here. Oh yeah, Elsa X is saying I should look at Iran. Yeah, I do look at Iran a lot, and you're absolutely right. The Scorpio Venus retrograde of 1978, going into 79, was really instrumental in the Iranian. I mean, that's when the Iranian Revolution really happened. The Shah of Iran was a red 5. He was born not long after Venus station direct. He would die during a red 3 of cancer. An event that that sort of triggered the Iranian the seizure of the hostages in late 79. The Shah needed medical attention for cancer, and Jimmy Carter was going to let him into the U.S. And in retaliation, the Iranian revolutionaries took a bunch of hostages, and that was a huge deal at the time. Elsa is asking, Pluto and Leo, is Leo significant for France? They feel like a Leonine country. Well, insofar as I'm ready to assign zodiac signs to countries, I would say, yeah, you're absolutely on the money. And the clincher there, I've talked about this, I think on Chris's astrology podcast, I mentioned this, but in the same way that you can look at American history with Uranus and Gemini, and you get the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and American involvement in Second World War. You get the sense when Uranus is in Gemini with the United States that the transit of Uranus through Gemini has this sort of reset effect on the nation, and whenever Uranus transits through Gemini, the United States goes through some big war, at the end of which it winds up redefining itself, sort of becoming a different, redefining it, not becoming a different country, but sort of redefining itself in some terms. Like, the American Revolutionary War, the U.S. became a country, a republic. The Civil War, of course, created a more sort of centralized government, and then the Second World War resulted in the U.S. becoming this global superpower. And at least while Uranus was in Gemini in the 40s, it was the only global superpower, because the Soviet Union only detonated their first nuclear bomb in August of 49, not long after Uranus left Gemini. So that was sort of when Uranus went into Cancer, that's when you got the Soviets becoming a rival global power with their own nuclear arsenal, and the Chinese Revolution, which resulted in the People's Republic of China. But with France, it's Uranus and Leo that you really get these. You get a similar effect that the country sort of redefines. And keep in mind, France is a country that has redefined itself more than most countries do. But you do get this sense of, here we are. We're back at the Bastille prison. Uranus in Leo. Oh yeah, I was going to talk about Uranus and Venus in Leo. Thank you for that reminder. Here we are again, Venus, Uranus at the Nazi mutiny. And I think you get it again when the Swiss Guard, there they are, when the Swiss Guard is attacked at the Tuileries Palace. This is a really bloody popular uprising where these guards are murdered. And a then unknown young Corsican named Napoleon Bonaparte is standing across the river watching this happen, and becomes sort of forever scarred and of seeing popular uprisings, and sort of, the theory is like, witnessing this event is what sort of turns him into the dictator he becomes. So yeah, you can see a lot of the like if we think about Uranus in Leo for France, everything involving the revolution, starting with the convening of the Estates General in May of 1789, and going right up until, past the. Whoops, I've just selected too many. This is the French Revolution with Uranus and Leo. So past the execution of the king, the execution of the queen, the terror, the Great Terror. You can see Danton is executed here. You can see Robespierre's cult of the supreme being, Robespierre being executed, Bonaparte being arrested and suspected for treason, but he's eventually released. So all that early stuff, all that pre-Napoleon part of the French Revolution is all Uranus and Leo. And then you get to the next time, and it's just after the Franco-Prussian War. The Franco-Prussian War happens when Uranus is in Cancer, and it's almost like they're, it's almost like they're a little bit early. But then everything that follows, the next, while Uranus is in Leo, like we get back to this big crisis with President Mahon, who was a monarchist president, and then the Republican Prime Minister Jules Simon, and the tussle between them, and France emerging. The Third Republic is sort of confirmed at this point. So they were sort of, things were in flux while Uranus was in Cancer, but when Uranus is in Leo, France properly becomes the Third Republic, or it's confirmed that it's going to survive. And then you jump ahead to the 1950s, and the next time France is in the next time Uranus is in Leo, and we get to the Suez Crisis, and of course everything going on in Algeria, the attempted junta, and the Charles de Gaulle giving a speech and sort of his ascent as the new French savior. He's proclaimed president of France. There's a new constitution. The Fifth French Republic is a Uranus and Leo entity, and it lasts right up until, as I was saying, the culmination of the Algerian Civil War, the Algerian independence being proclaimed, and the Oran massacre, which I was just describing, where you have once again Venus, Moon, Uranus in Leo. There's some combination of Venus and Uranus in Leo that gets kind of crazy. In fact, let's just look at that. It's a much smaller list, but it's really, you get. So here we are: Bastille, Nancy Mutiny, the French family's attempted escape, the massacre of the Swiss Guard, the Battle of Vendeschut, which is these are major, an unexpected French victory in a battle against Britain, and then this battle, Fleurus, just as Venus is going into Leo. This is the first battle to use a hot air balloon for reconnaissance. So the first time flight was used in a military capacity. And then some execution of some nuns. You can see Venus, Uranus, the nuns of Compiègne in 1794, at the very height of gosh, if they had managed to live a few more days, they might have survived like Thomas Paine did, because this is just before Robespierre is taken down. Yeah, and then, once again, we get to Algerian independence and the Oran massacre. There's something about Venus-Uranus conjunctions in Leo. Oh, shoot. Did I forget to share the screen? Oh, God damn it. I'm so sorry. Yeah, Montgolfier. I'm so sorry I didn't share the screen there. Okay. I've really got to get better at that. Oh, geez. I'm so embarrassed. All right. I'm going to try this again. I'm so mad at myself. All right. So there we are. This is the Venus-Uranus thing. We've got the Bastille prison, the Nancy mutiny, the French family attempting to escape, the attack on the Swiss Guard, the Battle of Vendeschut. Okay, that's a Venus ingress into Leo, as is Fleurus a year later. This is the one where the hot air balloon was used. The execution of the nuns at Compiègne in 1794. And yeah, later on, de Gaulle escapes a murder attempt, but the culmination is Algerian independence and then the Oran massacre. Just something about Venus and Uranus and Leo that's really, really powerful in French history. All right, so everyone, okay, so most of you are Al-Sisi's presidency in Egypt. Yeah, well, Egypt, I've done some work with, but it's not entirely up to date, and I want to do more before I talk about Egypt, but it would be a really fascinating subject as well. So yeah, I do have my eye on Iran, and I do have my eye on Egypt. And I've done more work with Iran. I might be able to talk about them soon, although I think of them as being more of the Iranian Revolution was a Venus retrograde revolution, but there's also a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about regarding Iran and the synodic cycle of Mars. And I think right now, because Venus retrograde is about to happen, I'm just more focused on talking about Venus, but Iran might come up in that context as well. But certainly, as we get past Venus retrograde and I start talking about other planets more, some people are already asking if I'm just going to talk about Venus retrograde forever, or the Venus synodic cycle forever, and certainly not. I'm interested in all the planets. It just seems to be the topical thing. There's a lot to cover. Yeah, suggestion taken, Jennifer. I do have a tablet that I gave to my daughter because hers broke, but I have to get myself a new one, which is on my shopping list. And Andrew Gott is asking here, how do I implement this within the context of the individual? Yeah, I know some people just want to talk about individuals and sort of not, some people just aren't interested in history and politics. And I do, I do horoscope readings. I am a working astrologer, so I do talk to individual people about, and I do use this material in horoscope readings. But yeah, very often on these live streams, I'm more interested in talking about history and politics and how that fits into a broader picture of astrology. And this way, people from all over the world can sort of participate and get something out of it. I think personal astrology is meant, it's a personal thing. It's more appropriate in the context of a consultation. I don't really want to read people's charts on a live stream. First of all, it's my job, it's how I pay my bills. And and secondly, just this live stream is for astrology students to get some other. I mean, so much of astrology training is focused on um, personal charts and things like that. And so I think it's healthy to have an avenue where we talk about other stuff. So, um, in terms of, but I mean, I do use it, I mean, but I don't have any sort of pithy statement to make about red twos. I have some observations, and sometimes I go through lists of people who are also red twos, and I'm sure to do that in a future date. So I mean, I do talk about people. I don't want to sort of wave that off entirely, but yeah, very often with this live stream, I want to talk about broad planetary cycles and broad geopolitical history, and have us look at, it's you can think of astrology as being like a camera that has different lenses, and some of those camera lenses will do really well with a deep close up of a person's eyeball, and then some camera lenses are great for taking shots of big mountain vistas and far away distances, and um, horoscopic astrology, when you're looking at a person's individual chart in their life, that's more like a sort of a close-up camera lens where you're just looking in on the person's face, and it's the only thing that's in the frame. And then sometimes you're a nature photographer and you climb up to some mountaintop and you take this panoramic photograph of a scene of nature or a cityscape or a forest or whatever. And yeah, this live stream, more often than not, I'm going to be, standing on the mountaintop and taking a picture, a big panoramic picture of the world, rather than sort of using that close-up lens to take a picture of a person's face. That's the analogy I like to use. Not that I don't. Again, I'm going to work in astrologer, and I take lots of photographs of people's faces, as it were. But yeah, for this conversation, I think what I really have to share with astrology students. Yeah, I think astrologers, I think we need to be, the smartest people in the room. I think we need to know more about the world than we do. No matter how much we know, there's always more to know. So I like to also just encourage in our dialogue as a community, um, conversations that involve broader topics than just sort of individual people. I hope that makes sense. It's not your bad, Andrew. It's a valid question. It's not, and it is one that'll come up. But yeah, if I'm talking about France, I don't want to suddenly go off and talk about a person. Cynthia's asking, wondering if you care to share my illness and okay, you're curious about my personal life. I had really extreme sleep apnea. Um, and it took over 5 years for them to diagnose it. This was part of the problem with the healthcare system in Montreal. Look, where the Canadian healthcare system works is like if you break your leg, they can fix it quick and do it well, and you don't get charged for anything. In fact, here's a great story. We in 2019, my family and I met up with my parents in Portugal. We were going to have a little family trip in Portugal, but my dad went and he was walking down a hill, a slope street in Lisbon, and slipped and broke his leg. And so we suddenly had to like rent a minivan to take us around Portugal. It sort of changed the whole family trip because my dad had this broken leg. But he, thankfully, since my wife speaks Portuguese, we got him good care in the hospital. And the Canadian health care system reimbursed my dad for, all his medical costs in Portugal, and even arranged for him to have a first class seat. He had flown to Portugal in coach, but he got to fly back in first class because he now had a broken leg and couldn't sit in your regular. And the Canadian healthcare system took care of that. So I know, like, my American friends who look longingly to Canada as a sort of idealized paradise of healthcare. That's one of the stories that I know. a lot of Americans would love to have, that level of care, and it's very good. And ideologically, I'm absolutely in favor of public health care. But there's a lot of problems, and something like sleep apnea, just you need a lot of machines, sleep tests, and so what would happen is, I doctor would say I need a sleep test, or I have to go into a hospital and have all these electrodes attached to me and sleep over the course of a night while they monitor how I sleep to determine if I have sleep apnea. And it would take like 11 months for me to wait for this test, and then another few months to get results of the test. And then the first time I did the test, it was inconclusive. And I would have to do it again, and I would have to wait another 11 months to take a test, and then another 3 months to have the results. And it just got crazy, and I couldn't work. I could barely move. And so, yeah, I mean, it just, that's basically it. I still have sleep apnea, but I know how to deal with it. I know how to treat it. And I live a mostly normal life. Every now and again, I have a day where I gotta crash, but I'm definitely a lot stronger than I was a decade ago. All right. Do I have a lot of Pisces or 12th house? No, I have no Pisces. I have a Taurus moon in the 10th that rules the 12th. So in a sense, my 12th house is strong because because the ruler of my 12th house is very strong. Um, you're not up to date. A name is saying, I'm not up to date. I just reached the bricks part. Some astrologer did a reading on the brick without SA and bricks with a SA. He said brick without SA has a prosperous chart. What do I think? I mean, I could look at the chart and maybe I'd be surprised and change my verdict. But like, China has no real navy. They don't have any ships that can sail further than like 1,000 kilometers from their mainland. They can't really. Ironically, they've probably benefited more from global trade than any other country on the planet, and that is and I say this not as some kind of like American cheerleader. I'm equally critical of American imperialism, but the reality is that it was American naval support that made globalization possible. Without that sort of protection in the seas, nobody's cargo could get anywhere because it would get hijacked here and there. And I just don't see, how China can possibly exist as it is, in a brick or bricks type arrangement. India's going to be fine, but India's got their own problems with China. Russia can survive at least for a while. I mean, obviously they're seeing the end of some things about their civilization, but at least they do export. They export some things, and that can keep their economy going a little bit. But China imports absolutely everything. If in a world without a U.S. Navy protecting the waterways, China's gonna be really hard put to get any fuel or food imported into their country, and they're a huge importer of both. And we could look at a bunch of charts, but I just don't see how realistically how they can make this arrangement work for themselves. I think South Africa and India could have a good trade arrangement, and South Africa and Brazil could, because it's pretty easy to sail between those countries without meeting too much resistance. There is some piracy in the Indian Ocean. There's a fair amount of it, but South Africa does have a submarine or two that they could probably escort ships over to India that were involved in trade. But that's about it. I don't see Russia or China really being able to get into like the kind of trade arrangement that everyone seems to think is possible. I could be wrong. But anyway, I could look at these charts for the BRICS arrangements and see what this other astrologer was talking about and why they think one would work and one wouldn't. But I have to say, even though I'm sort of bent towards the left myself, realistically speaking, I just don't see how those arrangements are going to work. China is an expansion. Well, China doesn't need to be expansion. I mean, we all know they want Taiwan, but aside from that, they don't really need to be expansionist. But they just don't have the means um, to do their own naval, protection. And any oil, like say if they're getting oil from Saudi Arabia, that oil has to pass by in order to reach China, has to sail by India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Indonesia, countries that could easily just sort of, would want to take that oil for themselves and probably could. That's really the issue. All right. Now let's see. Okay, I've kind of gone down the well, the deep well on the BRICS question and some of the others. I am sort of running out of steam. I mostly wanted to just sort of point out the stuff about France today. Of course, the diversions are always welcome. I take your questions and I respond. That's the way this live stream works. Next week, this live stream, I'm going to have my first guest. I'm going to have my friend Sam Reynolds guest on next Monday's live stream, and we're going to talk about an article I wrote years ago about Venus retrograde, the red 5 interval, and racial unrest and injustice in the United States over the course of red 5 transits, red 5 intervals, rather. Since 1791. So I hope you'll all join me next Monday. It's going to be more of a prepared show than I usually offer with these live streams. As you know, my Monday live stream is it's done off the cuff. I respond to questions, talk about the first thing that sort of comes to mind. Or, today I did come into the show with some intention of talking about France, but I didn't really prepare anything. I just had, what was in my database and shared that with you and talked about it. Next Monday's show, I mean, it is more prepared because I've had, I wrote this article years ago and I have slides that illustrate the whole thing really nicely. So next Monday's show is going to be really terrific. And Sam and I are old friends in astrology. He's one of my oldest friends in the astrology community. He and I used to both work for the same astrology phone service like 20 years ago. And so, we struck up a friendship then. We were the only two North Americans working for this British company. And Sam's a brilliant astrologer and always a great addition to any podcast and what have you. So I'm looking forward to having Sam, and that's going to be a great show. And less sort of off the cuff than I typically do with these live streams. But as always, I want to thank you all for coming this week and talking about France and the Saturn transits through Pisces and Aries and what's been going on there. Just to give you some context, since it's something that tends to pop up over there. All right. I'm out of steam. Thank you all so much for coming. Thanks for a great Monday. As always, I'm I'm always pleasantly surprised that people actually come to hear me ramble week after week. Obviously, you must be getting something out of it. I certainly get something out of it. So thank you all. And I'll see you next Sunday on the team stream with Patrick. And then again next Monday, I will be here with the great Sam Reynolds to talk about an epic Venus retrograde topic. So do come back. We'll see you next week. Ciao, y'all.